Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. You are at the Festival of Ideas. This is the 2023 Festival of Ideas, and this is the very first session. And I'm very, very happy to have to introduce you to our first speaker, who's here sitting, I think should be on the left of me on all our screens. And that is Professor Mark Shepard. Mark is an associate professor in the Department of Architecture and the Department of Media Study at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And it's where he also directs the Media Arts and Architecture program and co-directs the Center for Architecture and Situated Technologies, or CAST, as the center is called. He received his Bachelor of Architecture degree from Cornell University, and he holds two master's degrees, a Master of Fine Arts in Combined Media from Hunter College, City University of New York, and a Master of Science in Advanced Architectural Design from Columbia University. Mark is an artist, an architect, and a researcher who investigates contemporary entanglements of technology and urban life, spanning the themes of people and data, code and space, and knowledge and power. He's presented his work extensively all over the world at museums, galleries, and festivals, including the 2012 Venice International Architecture Biennial and the 2012 Dutch Electronics Arts Festival, the Barcelona Design Museum, and the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York. He's won several awards and honors, including the George Forster Peabody Award in New Media and the Jacob K. Javits Fellowship in the Humanities. I reached out to Mark because I came across his book, which was published at the end of last year by MIT Press. The book is called There Are No Facts: Attentive Algorithms, Extractive Data Practices, and the Quantification of Everyday Life. It's received a great deal of acclaim. I've picked out one review to share with you. One reviewer stated the following about the book: compellingly argued and richly illustrated, Shepard recasts lying with statistics for the algorithmic age. Essential reading for anyone interested in how knowledge production is contextualized, corrupted, and used in pernicious ways. I can't think of a more appropriate person to start to launch the Festival of Ideas this year, given the theme of AI, which is now dominant in all of our discourse. Dr. Shepard, thank you for being here. He will be speaking on the topic, There Are No Facts, Everyday AI and Everyday Life.
Well, first, thanks, Anna, for the invitation. This is really wonderful to be able to be here and to kick off this great 3 days of your festival, the festival that the Torrance Center is organizing. So I'm very, very pleased to be here. Let me try to see if we can get the screen share up and running, and we'll start from there. Let's see. Okay. Oh, yeah, let me just try once again. Okay. How does that look? Does everybody see that?
Yes.
Great.
Perfect.
Okay. So again, thanks for inviting me. Pleased to be here. I'm going to talk today a little bit about this question about there are no facts. We'll talk about algorithms. We'll talk about data and a little bit about everyday life. And the talk is drawn from my recent book, as Anna mentioned, was published by MIT Press last fall. And I'd like to begin with a familiar face from the recent past, I'd say, as a way to position our current situation.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. It's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you, and stay woke, bitches.
Okay, so this video, conceived as a form of public service announcement, was produced in April 2018 by stand-up comedian and film director Jordan Peele and Buzzland founder and CEO Jonah Peretti. It incorporated artificial intelligence and machine learning techniques to create what has come to be popularly known as a deepfake. The PSA aimed to call attention to the capacity of this technology to manipulate the media landscape and warn viewers about trusting content they encounter online. To date, it's received more than 9 million views on YouTube. Not everyone found it funny, however. The potential to apply synthetic media techniques to the fabrication of apparent political realities was not lost on 3 members of Congress, who in September 2018 sent a letter to the Director of National Intelligence warning of their use in spreading misinformation in the context of a political campaign. Now, deep fakes are a precursor to the generative AI models like DALL-E 2, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion that are at the center of the debate surrounding synthetic media today. They're produced employing a machine learning architecture called a generative adversarial network, or GAN. Now, GANs are created by simultaneously training 2 neural networks and pitting them against each other. One network, called the generator, is trained on a data set from which it attempts to synthesize something, while the other, called the discriminator, attempts to discern whether that something is real, in other words, that it came from the existing training data set, or fake, that it was synthesized by the generator. When the discriminator can no longer determine whether the image came from the training set or was made by the generator, the training of the GAN is complete. Now, what I think is important to note here is that this architecture is, at its core, adversarial in nature, right? It's based on synthesizing a reality, the veracity of which is discerned by an algorithm. Its mode of operation is deception, and its outcomes divisive. And I would suggest that this architecture serves as a cultural marker for our present moment. So in 2016, Oxford Dictionaries declared post-truth its word of the year, defining the adjective as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. This was, after all, the year that brought us political campaigns for the US presidential election and the UK Brexit referendum. Whether it be the claim by then presidential candidate, Donald Trump, that climate change was a Chinese hoax intended to make US manufacturers less competitive, or the British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson's claim in the run-up to the referendum that the UK sends £350 million to the EU each week in membership fees, lying to the public as part of a concerted campaign strategy had become commonplace on both sides of the Atlantic. Indeed, we had entered an era of alternative facts, as newly minted White House advisor Kellyanne Conway would tell Chuck Todd on Meet the Press in response to his question about why Press Secretary Sean Spicer would openly lie about Trump's inauguration crowd size. Yet, as The Economist pointed out in an editorial published in September of that year, it wasn't so much lying itself that was the problem. Politicians have, of course, done this for centuries. Rather, we simply didn't seem to care that much for the truth anymore. Serbian-American playwright Steve Tesich coined the term post-truth in a 1992 article for The Nation, writing about the cognitive fallout from the Iran-Contra affair. In a very fundamental way, he writes, as a free people, we have freely decided that we want to live in some post-truth world. Years later, comedian Stephen Colbert coined the term truthiness to describe people who think with their head, but know with their heart. Truth is not falsified or contested, wrote The Economist's editors in 2016, but of secondary importance. In campaigns like the 2016 presidential election and the UK Brexit referendum, feelings were what mattered, not facts. From the weaponization of social media through psychometric micro-targeting and its radically divisive outcomes, to the proliferation of online fact-checking services and media filtering algorithms intended to counter them, we have witnessed the dissolution of much of the common ground on which truth claims were once negotiated, individual agency enacted, and public spheres shaped. At the same time, the extraction of behavioral data from all walks of life, both online and off, and their subsequent processing and sale for profit has led to the emergence of micropublics of ever finer granularity. This statistical world of big data and machine learning, one where correlation supersedes causation, is driven by probable futures ranked by degrees of confidence. It presents an epistemology that eschews expressing facts, representing spaces, and developing representative models in favor of evolving models that are in and of themselves territories. Within this context, the notion of ground truth is replaced by that of ground fiction, whereby inference supplants direct observation. So in the book, I explore the uncommon ground that we share in this post-truth world. I map uncharted territory emerging in the wake of these epistemic transformations and the spatial milieu within which they have transpired. I attempt to unpack and explicate how these post-truth territories are propagated through machine learning systems and social networks, which shape the public and private spaces of everyday life, govern the social relations that transpire within them, and delineate a politics of possible subject positions we are enabled to enact individually and collectively. I probe how these spatial conditions bracket what we know about the world, how they construe our agency to act within it, and how they shape these spaces that in turn shape us. Now, as a means to set up the discussion that will follow the talk, I thought it would be useful to introduce a set of thematic threads and define a few key terms encountered throughout the book. The first concerns the related notions of misinformation and disinformation. Whereas misinformation refers to incorrect or misleading information, disinformation refers to false information deliberately and often covertly spread in order to influence public opinion or obscure truth. The proliferation of falsehoods throughout social media is commonly understood as being related to both the types of news sources the internet makes available and the inability of consumers of this information to differentiate between valid and invalid statements. And these platforms are designed to capitalize on this. Algorithms driving social media feeds are designed to filter content based on its ability to maximize user engagement through shares and likes, thereby promoting the proliferation of post-truth terrain across this network. Now, research has shown, for instance, that tweets containing false statements spread 6 times faster on Twitter than those containing truthful ones. And contrary to conventional wisdom, it's primarily humans, not bots, who are responsible. Bots are as adept at spreading true statements as they are falsehoods. Lies shared widely among online communities like 4chan and 8chan are swiftly believed to be true, as their members often trust each other more than they do the proverbial mainstream media. Information that supports previously held beliefs is readily adopted, a tendency we know as confirmation bias. Conversely, when confronted with evidence that challenges strongly held beliefs, many have a tendency to dig in and double down. Now, in a response to sustained public criticism following the 2016 elections, social media platforms and online news sources began to introduce fact-checking services. Fact checkers at the Washington Post, for example, had counted 492 statements made by President Trump in his first 100 days in office alone, and no fewer than 30,573 throughout the course of his term. Facebook rolled out its third-party fact-checking project that involved independent organizations debunking false news stories and Facebook pledging to make its users aware of the findings, while lowering the rank of its post in users' news feeds. Yet, as evidenced by Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's testimony in Congress as late as fall 2019, Facebook continued to struggle in its attempts to combat the spread of fake news using a combination of algorithms and human review. And despite the best intentions of the Washington Post fact checkers, some people still believe that China invented the concept of global warming in order to make US manufacturing less competitive, despite the fact that Trump himself has walked back that statement. But, we might step back from the fray and ask, is controlling truth through socio-technical gatekeeping systems the best way to address this epistemic conundrum? Addressing the role of online fact-checking services, sociologist and science and technology studies scholar Nortje Morris has questioned whether or not these technologies actually help or hinder the reinvigoration of a public sphere based on publicly verified facts. Modeled on what is commonly known as the correspondence model of truth, a philosophical model that distinguishes between legitimate and illegitimate knowledge claims via logical empiricist procedures, these fact-checking technologies revive long-standing concerns regarding how and by whom knowledge claims are validated. She reminds us that not too long ago, we were concerned that evidence-based political debate can lead to placing authority outside the public sphere and exclusively within the domain of experts. Seeing this as a return to a kind of knowledge demarcation between those deemed capable of knowing and those who are not, she views this approach as a step backward in the drive toward social inclusion in public debate and the creation of a knowledge democracy, one that further divides existing partisan factions polarized around the notion of an elite class with a privileged claim to knowledge of the world. Now, against empirical claims that there are only facts, philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously countered, no, it's precisely facts that do not exist, only interpretations. This statement, which he makes in a posthumously published fragment, can be found in various alternate expressions throughout his work, receiving extended consideration in his 1873 essay, Truth and Lie in an Extramoral Sense. Such a claim not only marks the birth of postmodernism, his critics argue, but also highlights his shortcomings as a philosopher. The statement, there are no facts, only interpretations, they say, as with any other relativist statement, must also include itself. The fact that there are only interpretations is itself subject to interpretation and therefore can't be confirmed. Others suggest that this critique grossly oversimplifies the matter, reminding us that Nietzsche's statement was aimed at undermining positivist notions of an absolute truth. Philosopher Helmut Haidt suggests that Nietzsche was arguing in favor of a self-reflexive, pluralistic, and modest epistemic attitude associated with relativism. Unlike certain cliché versions of relativism, writes Haidt, Nietzsche denies that every perspective is equally valid and develops and employs a variety of interpretive and argumentative standards that are not absolute, but allow human evaluations of knowledge claims. Here, he suggests that the suggestion that truth is the only alternative to post-truth is itself a false opposition, one that obscures the role that informed value judgments play in politics and culture. And that's the point here. Now, the late philosopher, sociologist, and anthropologist Bruno Latour upended the traditional philosophical distinctions between facts or scientific knowledge on the one hand and values or human judgments on the other. To Latour, scientific facts are the product of scientific inquiry. In his 1979 book, Laboratory Life, The Construction of Scientific Facts, written with Steve Woolgar, he shows how facts are produced through the daily practices of scientists working in a lab. For Latour and Woolgar, the validity of a fact is not based on an inherent veracity, but rather on the strength of the assemblage of people and things, institutions and practices that brought that fact into being. Facts that are no more networked socially, ones involving more people and things in their production, are more valid than those that are less so. Validity here is a function of a broader social apparatus. Critics argue that by showing that facts are the product of an often messy human procedure, Latour and Woolgar have enabled a particularly noxious form of relativism, one that cynical conservatives were quick to appropriate. Witness the rise of the climate denier and other anti-science positions, for example, or the election denier, for that matter. Now, Latour would push back on this critique in a later book, saying that facts remain robust only when they are supported by a common culture, by institutions that can be trusted, by a more or less decent public life, by more or less reliable media. The problem is that there are now those who no longer believe that there is such a thing as a common world, which, for Latour at least, changes everything. It's not a matter of learning how to repair cognitive deficiencies, he writes, but rather how to live in the same world, share the same culture, face up to the same stakes, perceive a landscape that can be explored in concert. Okay, so I'm interested in the questions that inevitably follow what Latour identifies as an inability to perceive a landscape that can be explored in concert. These questions assemble not just the material realities of an evacuated public space, but also the immaterial conditions by which a disaggregated public sphere is perceived. If public space is no longer the geography of the public sphere, what constitutes the ground on which truth claims are based, argued, and validated or invalidated today? What may we consider common ground when publics are strategically segmented by the deployment of machine learning and artificial intelligence as instruments of political and epistemic design? What may we consider a public sphere when the traditional sites of representation and deliberation are disaggregated into a plurality of digitally mediated environments that elide the now vestigial physical infrastructures that helped shape the very notion of public in the first place? While these are by no means new questions, they do take on a different character in light of certain recent events in the socio-technical systems by which they are enabled, engendered, shared, and distributed. As I address throughout the book, these technologies, tools, and techniques and methods by which we perceive this landscape that Latour would have us explore in concert are by no means neutral and are themselves propagating forms of bias, discrimination, and divisiveness for which we have to account. Computer scientists Joy Buolamwini and Timothy Gebru have shown how commercial face recognition systems are less effective for women of color, for instance. And a growing body of research shows how predictive policing systems perpetuate systemic racism. Further, researchers such as sociologist Rua Benjamin and media theorist Wendy Chun recount how, for certain populations, these forms of social control have long been implemented through specific planning practices, design paradigms, and other technological forms. Indeed, the public realm today is constituted less by what philosopher Hannah Arendt once called a space of appearance. In other words, a public space within which we appear before each other in all of our differences to be able to protest and to deliberate. But moreover, by what we might today describe as spaces of surveillance, incorporating not only the disciplinary and control apparatus that philosophers Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze concerned themselves with, but also more recent techniques for the extraction of behavioral data by surveillance capitalists that social psychologist and former Harvard Business School Professor Shoshana Zuboff has described in her book. The challenge we face then resides in articulating new forms of appearance within the various shared spaces of contemporary publics through which we come together, ones that extend horizontally across and against the divisive vertical segmentation of spaces of surveillance and support an ongoing struggle to formulate more empowering and enduring collective identities. So how do we approach this challenge? I would suggest that first, it involves adopting a spatial framework by which the various sites and situations that this book maps are examined. In focusing on the spatiality of these contexts, I argue that to consider them not just through a socioeconomic lens, right, as the byproduct of instruments of control or resource allocation, but also as a political and an environmental one, where the governmentality or the governing rationality at work and in play across these sites is understood through an examination of the spatial practices mediated by instruments of design and spatial management that operate within them. So Foucault defined the notion of governmentality in terms of the strategies and tactics by which society is rendered governable, and emphasized the close link between forms of power and processes of subjectification. In articulating disciplinary mechanisms of power, whether those deployed in the management of an 18th century French town during an outbreak of the plague, or those residing in Jeremy Bentham's prototypical design for a prison, Foucault describes these governing principles in terms of the reconfiguration of space. Space, power, and subjectivity are for Foucault inextricably intertwined within the notion of governmentality. So understanding how we come to know space, how we locate and orient ourselves within it, and how we navigate through it are thus critical to understanding the epistemic fragmentation of these post-truth territories and their corresponding implications for subject positioning. How we come to know the world around us and our place within it is contingent on these mental models of space that predominate our different cultures. These mental models are themselves informed and shaped by the instruments, devices, and representational techniques by which spatial cognition takes place. Whereas observational devices, such as the camera, shape the perceptual conditions, primarily at the scale of the body, by which space is apprehended, representational techniques, such as mapping, often engage the space entirely, the entirety of which cannot be perceived from a single vantage point, but is understood either through movement over time or by incorporating more complex information systems. And this slide here is an image of it's actually a series of images by artist James Bridle that maps layers of a neural network designed for an autonomous vehicle navigation system. The legibility of the system of the images incrementally dissolves as the logic of the machine's vision system becomes less and less correspondent to human understanding. Today, these instruments, devices, and techniques are increasingly driven by machine learning algorithms operating on vast amounts of data extracted from all walks of life. Machine learning algorithms designed for recognition and classification tasks perceive the world by comparing features extracted from an object or event with those from a data set derived from hundreds, thousands, or even millions of examples on which they have been trained. This collection of features related to a property or a characteristic of a given object or event is called a feature space. A well-designed feature space contains clusters or groups of data points where similar objects or events are closer to each other and dissimilar ones more distant. New and previously seen on objects or events are rendered perceptible by these algorithms through a process of attribution, where proximity to clusters within a feature space determines the probability expressed in terms of degrees of confidence that they can be attributed to a known quantity. Now, I refer to the clusters produced by these processes of perceiving, recognizing, and attributing as statistical imaginaries. Within sociology, the imaginary refers to a set of values, institutions, laws, and symbols through which people imagine their relation to society as a whole. In his book, The Imaginary, A Phenomenological Psychology of the Imagination, Jean-Paul Sartre contrasts the imagination to perception, whereby perception apprehends only a part of an object, and imagination constructs a totality. Imaginary objects are to Sartre a melange of past impressions and a recent knowledge. They are what we imagine them to be, appearing to us as if we were to perceive them, as if they were real. For psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, the imaginary is introduced as one of three interrelated orders, together with the symbolic and the real, that structure human existence. The imaginary emerges in the stage of a child's development, which is called the mirror stage, when they develop the ability to recognize themselves as an object that can be perceived outside themselves, such as through a mirror or other device. Because the ego is formed by identifying with a counterpart or mirror image, identification becomes an important aspect of the imaginary for Lacan. Yet in recognizing oneself as I, one also recognizes oneself as other, an act that is fundamentally self-alienating. Now, one could argue that today we come to recognize ourselves not in the specular truth of a mirror image, but in the complex assemblage of data sets and aggregate information that constitutes the disembodied, decentered, and distributed nature of our data bodies. The ideological totality that we simultaneously relate to and are alienated by is the statistical imaginary, a market segment, a demographic tranche, a body without organs distributed across a probabilistic future space composed of data points registered in discrete time series. Statistical imaginaries are bound by intersectional constructions of identity, where attributes such as race, gender, class, sexuality, religion, age, ability, appearance, and the like intersect in not only positioning one's identity, but also determining how they are privileged and discriminated against within society. This notion of positioning, of accounting for one's own position in making truth claims in the production of knowledge, is considered at length by feminist scholars, among them Donna Haraway, who suggests that positioning is itself the key practice in grounding knowledge. Yet while situating knowledge production in this way can help account for embedded power relations that often go unnoticed or overlooked, or worse, form the basis for discriminatory and oppressive practices, it also highlights the challenges posed for finding common ground. In the introduction to their book, Data Feminism, Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein point out how the racism embedded in US culture, coupled with many other forms of oppression, made it impossible to claim a common experience or a common movement for all women everywhere. Indeed, the challenge associated with invoking the word we within the context of this book is in and of itself instructive. Who is included when we are addressed and who is left out? Who? Those who are reading this? Those who come from common ethnic, cultural, economic, and educational backgrounds? We who are proximate in a feature space of possible subject positions? How can this we find common ground, a collective sense of we-ness, so to speak, within these spaces that otherwise seek to simultaneously segment and cluster people in ways that are often oppressive, increasingly indifferent, and in some cases outright hostile to the very idea of what can be described as the unattributable commonalities that bind us. So in the chapters that make up the book, I examine these contemporary entanglements of people and data, code and space, knowledge and power. Part one addresses the specific practices that are threaded throughout the book, the fabrication of post-truth representational spaces in chapter one, map making and the politics of cartographic representations in chapter 2, and the extraction of behavioral data and the corresponding impact on subject positioning in chapter 3. These chapters introduce how truth claims are embedded within the techniques by which the world is recorded, documented, and measured, how specific representational practices shape mental images of space, and how these data-saturated environments position divergent contemporary subjectivities. Part two then is organized according to an increasing scale of sites within which these practices play out, from the translocality of the home, the planetary reach of the COVID-19 pandemic, with stops along the way at the corner urban mini market, a neighborhood for the proverbial 1%, a waterfront district in Toronto, and a national election. These sites serve as specific context within which this story unfolds, a series of vignettes presenting the scope and extent of the epistemic fragmentation resulting from the mapping and colonization of the spaces constituting everyday life by attentive algorithms and extracted data practices. As the scale progressively increases throughout the book, the story evolves from more personal and intimate sites of behavioral data and extraction and the manipulation of individuals to more public and collective forms of algorithmic governance distributed across ever broader territories. These contexts provide vehicles by which to explore how these spatial conditions are conceived, planned, designed, constructed, inhabited, managed, analyzed, celebrated, and at times feared. So in chapter 4, for example, with artificial cohabitants, I look at the introduction of Siri and Alexa, these artificially intelligent virtual assistants, into the domestic space of the home, and look at how interpersonal relationships are reconfigured between public and private in the process. Spurious Correlations, chapter 5, looks at, for example, how Amazon Go, Amazon's foray into the grocery business, the bricks and mortar grocery business, becomes a kind of gristmill for harvesting behavioral data from the prosaic activities of everyday shopping for groceries, and the mining of this data and the sale for profit on futures behavioral markets. From Tools to Environments, chapter 6 looks at Hudson Yards in New York City, and specifically the proposed quantified community by NYU's Center for Urban Science and Progress. And it asks, how do these approaches to shaping, let's say, the quantification of not selves, but communities, work to nudge behavior towards specific directions that might be more amenable to neoliberal agendas in a neighborhood populated primarily by the 1%. The Right to the Wrong City then looks at the waterfront district in Toronto called Quayside, proposed for development by Sidewalk Labs, a spinoff of Google, which looked at this question about behavioral extraction at an urban scale, at the district of waterfront in Toronto, and ultimately a project which failed not only because of the privacy concerns of alarmed citizens, but also due to a blatant land grab that was made to try to take a proposal for a 12-acre site and expand it to 600 acres along the waterfront in Toronto. The Ruse and the Exploit then takes this question of the pernicious role of psychographic micro-targeting and the creation of custom media content distributed through Facebook to micro-publics as perhaps as small as one, in the event to nudge an electorate, an already divided electorate, one direction or another. Then finally, the pandemic exceptionalism, I look at this question of how our trust and belief in data and data models were developed differently in different parts of the world over the course of the pandemic. How, in corresponding ways, technologies differentiated between different approaches to how you would segment and manage the mobility of populations, whether it was in Sweden on the one hand, where the trust in kind of a cognizant liberal subject in maintaining and managing their own behavior in public space in responsible ways, or a more coercive approach in China, where a vast security apparatus was marshaled in locking down an entire country. All of this brings to fore the question of our agency to act and enact collectively within these new and emerging entanglements of people and data, code and space, knowledge and power. And I conclude the book with a coda that takes the street protests in the United States stemming from the murder of George Floyd in the early summer 2020, and the storming of the US Capitol on January 6, 2021, as a context to consider how social media have appropriated public space in the struggle to articulate collective identities via shared affect. Here, the various scales discussed throughout the book are inevitably intertwined. How from the comforts of home on lockdown, we bore witness to the killing of a Black man on a street corner in front of an urban mini market that ignites protests against police brutality and calls for racial justice that captivated a nation and spread rapidly to different parts of the world. That the existential void of locked down pandemic urban space would quickly be filled by various warring political and cultural factions, both online and physical space, was predictable, if not inevitable. The physical occupation of public space in Portland, Oregon, and Seattle that summer, pitting self-described Proud Boys against Antifa activists in open urban warfare, and the storming of the Capitol by a violent mob of Trump supporters at the beginning of the new year vividly illustrated how finding common ground today is an agnostic process of perpetual negotiation and struggle, one in which various actors continually articulate and defend competing conceptions of cultural and political identity. That these socio-technical assemblages are perhaps becoming more unevenly distributed across disparate social, cultural, and economic realities than they have ever been is arguably one of the more important challenges to this post-truth condition. In times of crisis like these, finding common ground would appear to be more important than ever. And the challenge is to better understand the topography of these conditions and how to navigate their contingent territories. So again, if public space today is no longer the geography of the public sphere, and the public realm is constituted more by what we might describe as spaces of surveillance than spaces of appearance, the challenge we face is articulating new forms of appearance within the various shared spaces of contemporary publics within which we come together, ones that extend horizontally across and against the divisive vertical segmentation of spaces of surveillance and support an ongoing struggle to formulate more empowering and enduring collective identities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was incredible. Please, I urge all of you to put your questions to Dr. Shepherd in the chat window, and if you'd rather ask directly, just use the raise hand function. Oops, sorry, I'm having some problems seeing the chat window here. So thank you so much, Mark. Would you maybe stop sharing your screen, and then I can spotlight you and people can ask questions to you. I will ask the first one then. I mean, in what ways do you see this? I would say I recognize this from the AI side, but talking about some levels of lack of transparency in what's going on. We don't really understand what's happening with the data there. But haven't we always had propaganda? Haven't we always dealt with this situation? So how is this really that? Is it just a sense of that the scale is different now, and so we have more to worry about? Are we looking at so the thing is, are we getting too frightened too quickly? Thank you, Adian. I hope I pronounced that name correctly. I will come to you next. Is it a paranoia that we have? Is it so different from what we've done before, just at a different scale? Or are we looking at something that's quite alien and very different, and that we need to therefore take action against understanding this data, understanding what all of this means in a way that we haven't done before? Sorry for the poor articulation of that question, but
yeah, that's no.
Sense, yeah.
You go ahead. No, that's absolutely the question we need to be asking. I mean, on the one hand, it certainly is longstanding, this problem that one has, vis-a-vis the manipulation of public opinion around an agenda, an issue, a policy, and so forth. In the book, I cite early pamphleteer James Callender, who was one of the first people set for or charged with sedition for spreading such misinformation and disinformation at the time. So propaganda, misinformation, disinformation is longstanding. What I argue is that today we're dealing with a different context than, let's say, kind of 19th or even 20th century public sphere. And when we're dealing with a situation such as what's afforded through social media with psychographic micro-targeting, where, for example, Christopher Wiley, one of the whistleblowers in the Cambridge Analytica scandal a couple of years ago, writes about what they were doing and says, well, imagine a public space where you have a stage and people are presenting two opposing positions. But rather than being able to, everyone hearing everything that's being said, it's more like somebody's, walking around in the crowd and whispering something in each person's ear in that crowd, and potentially whispering something different. Right. So it's not just that, we have opposing views, but we don't actually really even know the information that each other is consuming and receiving and operating on. And I think that's what I point to when I talk about the kind of fracturing of a common ground, right? There's not a space to refute, to push back, to challenge or counter a position in the space which is divisively dividing publics into populations as small as one, potentially.
That's right.
And so I would say that is qualitatively what's changed. That's the difference. That's our challenge. And so within this context, we have to find ways where we can, and this is, I look to Hannah Arendt in this regard, how do we find spaces of appearance where we can come together? And this isn't about a return to, say, kind of nostalgias about direct democracy and coming together in the town square and footing, but how do we find ways where we can view the entirety of a person, right? Beyond, there's me speaking in this frame that I've set up in this room, but what happens when you're also able to see my socks, or the hole in the back of my pants? You have a larger picture of who's speaking, and this is the subject position from which I'm potentially making a knowledge claim. And I'm arguing that that's what we're losing. That's where we have to find ways to kind of recreate those indirect back channel feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, a more holistic understanding of people, and also to say, well, one opinion does not make a person, or one view on something does not make a person.
Sure.
Adrian, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. First of all, thank you for doing a pretty good job pronouncing my name. It's a Dutch name, Arjan. Thank you very much. And also thank you, Mark, for delivering a eye-opening, thought-provoking, very relevant talk. Not really a question, but more like I see a connection between, there was lately a relevant discussion between Elon Musk and a BBC reporter. I don't know if everyone saw it. And then Musk stated at one point, who is the arbiter of what is misinformation or information to someone? So I thought I saw the connections over there. Can you elaborate on that one, Mark? Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, he's making, he's raising an important issue, right? And a little bit like, Nurchi Martis, which I'm probably mispronouncing terribly, the sociologist and science and technology studies scholar who I referred to in the book, makes the same claim, right? Who is responsible for being the arbitrator of truth? And she basically argues against this notion of fact checking and these sort of online systems that would create sort of gatekeeping to knowledge claims which are true and those which aren't true. Rather, she argues more, and it's this is in a way related to notions of a kind of deliberative democracy or a kind of agonism, where the process of trying to argue and debate and to come to terms with what is actual, what is factual, what is what is true, is the point. That we need to develop better tools by which we can parse, interpret it, and the way we can develop better ways to sensitize ourselves to understanding and parsing the veracity or falsehood ourselves, right? And that's a collective process, and it's one that's frankly at the basis of a democratic society. So I think Musk is pointing to that, but I don't think he's offering any solutions, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for that question and the answer. Ravi,
thank you.
Would you like to go next?
Thank you, Anna and Dr. Mark. In the Philippines, we're still having a debate about historical revisionism and distortion So I don't know if have you written something about in your book, but what is your take on revisionizing or revising history and distorting it?
Thank you for your question, Randy. I don't deal that much with historical revision. It's a topic which I think is absolutely related to this question of defining because through, for example, monuments. We've had in this country recently over the last 5 years or so a like other places around the world, a movement of replacing monuments, right? In different parts, whether it's a monument to Christopher Columbus, right? And changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, or looking at monuments in the South, right? Which are, supporting or memorializing Confederate soldiers, right? In the Civil War. And this kind of revisionist histories are always a question of who is narrating history, and history being narrated ultimately by those dominant and in power. And as power changes, as it fluctuates, so does that history, right? So we can't look to history as something, and Foucault writes about this in his introduction to his book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, and in that he's talking about the kind of sort of archival research looking at in sort of southern France, not the kind of major metropolitan areas, but he's looking at these small towns in France, and they're recording basically events surrounding different things happening around the time. And interestingly enough, during some of the most significant moments, such as when the plague hit, in some towns, there's no mention of that. There's no recorded history of the plague. And he raises the question is like, to the extent that knowledge is based on records, right? On documents, on recording, on remembering, that memory itself is imperfect. People inscribing it. There is no such thing as a kind of absolute truth, based in recorded history, unfortunately. It would be nice if there were, but the fact is that these things are always questions of questions and subject to contest and debate, and subject to fluctuating power.
Thank you, Mark.
Oh, sorry, there's a long question in the chat window that I'm going to read out to you. Hi, Mark. I listened to your presentation attentively. However, due to my lack of familiarity with the subject of interest and the level of terminology present, I feel like I've failed to generate an overall coherent understanding from the information presented. Building from my experience through the information in public space, still to simpler versions before shared, considering the lack of expertise average person lacks in any given information present, how would you consider the contribution of such ignorance on our propensity to follow the path of least resistance, weighing on our emotional and personal beliefs, and disregard evidence, even when the evidence is presented from an intentioned, reliable source? Is the inherent nature of the complexity of information and the contemporary propagation of access to information by the general public to such information a contributing factor to post-truth? Great question. Thank you, Sinan Akalan. And that will be our last question as well.
Yeah, no, I think that is absolutely an important question. And, I think the work we have to do is, in translating some of these more abstract concepts to a broader audience. And the book is a step in that direction. And, I recognize that, it's still, within the context of a 45-minute presentation, hard to go into depth and detail about, what's really happening within these black boxes, which, frankly, even for some of the people, the engineers, software engineers, creating them, they're even black boxes to them. They don't fully understand how it is that they're working. So this question, though, I think of, I want to go back to this question about naivete, and I don't see naivete as a kind of weakness. I actually see it as a strength in this context, and to a certain extent, it's very easy to become very smart about these technologies very quickly, right? One can understand and wrap their heads around, if not the kind of details like an engineer would, at least have a general understanding of the way that they work in the world. And as such, I think, you end up running into problems of, certain blinders, whereas, naivety has a wonderful ability to see things other people don't. And mostly because you're not kind of approaching it from a certain frame of reference or sort of received ideas regarding a kind of knowledge demarcation, right? So it's just that demarcation between sort of, say, naivety as something which is weak, versus a kind of informed, knowledgeable, subject or expert, that I think we need to kind of disassemble, and we need to recognize that, to really address this question, we need to get better at working at the interpretive processes socially and collectively. Now, I would end by just saying that, I think one can look at the climate crisis, for example, and we all know, and we've known for a while, that we're all complicit in this crisis. Our activities, while we strive to do the best, we still do things like sometimes get on an airplane. We don't often reuse as much. We know about recycling, but we don't think often enough maybe about reusing things. And I think that one of the things, and so we're complicit in this. And one of the things about this sort of, the idea that somehow we're all complicit in this sort of data society, this data-driven society that we're living in, right? And the way that we participate in that, to a certain extent, has made our data-driven culture too big to fail. And it might be just this condition that is our new inconvenient truth. I would just sort of maybe sort of end there and think about how is it that, what happens if we raise these issues about the role of the machine learning and artificial intelligence and their implications and impact on everyday life? What happens when that is understood at the same level with the same sense of urgency that we do with climate change?
That's a wonderful note to end on. Awareness is what will basically be our strength. Thank you so much for this really important talk and a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for being here. The next session starts in about 2 minutes, so I encourage you to go there. Thank you again, Mark. It was absolutely tremendous. Please, everyone, give a round of applause, at least virtually. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, and see you in the next session. I hope many of you.